Emily had spent years trying to forget the whispers, the nightmares, the way the bear's cold, glassy eyes had stared into her soul. But some things refused to stay buried. It had been 7 years since her family abandoned that cursed house, since they left everything behind, including the bear. She had convinced herself it was all in her head, a trick of childhood imagination. But deep down she knew better. Some nightmares never fade, they wait. On the morning of her 15th birthday, a package sat on the doorstep. There was no return address, no indication of where it had come from, just a small yellowed box wrapped in brittle paper. Her name was written on top in faded ink. Emily. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, her pulse hammering in her ears. She peeled away the paper, her breath catching in her throat as the lid creaked open. The bear was inside. Teddy. Its fur was still matted and dirty, its black eyes lifeless. But for a split second she could have sworn they moved, a glint of something dark flashing beneath them. She shoved the box away, her heartbeat racing. This wasn't possible. The bear had been burned. She had seen it reduced to ashes. And yet, here it was back in her hands. That night, she locked it away in the farthest corner of her closet, buried under a pile of clothes. But when she woke up, it was sitting on her pillow. The whispers started again. At first, they were soft, almost comforting, creeping into her dreams like a lullaby. "I missed you, Emily." She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was stress, a hallucination. But the voice became clearer, stronger. "Your parents don't understand you. They never did. I'm the only one who truly loves you." She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. Shadows pooled under her eyes, and her mother's worried glances turned to fear. One evening as they sat for dinner, Emily looked up from her untouched plate and asked, "Who is Margaret?" Her father's face turned ashen, his hands tightening around his fork. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, his voice tense. "Teddy told me," she said, her voice flat. "He said she used to live in our house. He said she was bad." Her mother's fork clattered to the floor. "Emily, we don't talk about Margaret. She's not part of our family anymore." But that wasn't enough. The bear had planted the seed. That night, as she lay in bed, she whispered, "Teddy, who is Margaret?" The answer came in a voice darker than before, a voice that sent chills slithering down her spine. "She was your aunt. She lived here long ago. But she did something terrible, something unforgivable." Emily's curiosity grew into obsession. She spent hours locked in her room talking to the bear. Her parents tried to take it away, but she fought them, her eyes flashing with something they didn't recognize. "If you touch him again," she whispered, her voice eerily calm, "he will make you suffer." That night, her mother woke to the sound of scratching at her bedroom door. Then came a whisper, soft yet chilling. "Let me in." Her father, desperate for answers, searched through old family records. What he found left him cold. An old newspaper article from 1952. 8-year-old Margaret found dead. Family claims possession. His hand shook as he turned the pages, finding a journal that had once belonged to the girl. The entries were erratic, filled with frantic scrawls. "Teddy says I have to do it. He says it's the only way to make them pay." The final entry, dated the day Margaret died, read, "Teddy says it's time. We'll be together forever." The bear had been burned before, but it had come back. It always came back. Emily's father called in a priest, a last desperate attempt to rid their daughter of whatever darkness had latched onto her. The moment the priest stepped inside Emily's room, she turned to him, her face expressionless. "He doesn't like you," she whispered. The air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural presence. Shadows twisted and coiled, forming the shape of something tall and spindly, with hollow, hungry eyes. The priest began to chant, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Emily's body convulsed. The bear twitched in her lap, its eyes glowing a sickly shade of green. The whispers turned to shrieks, hundreds of voices all crying out at once. The walls trembled. The lights flickered. The bear's stitched mouth began to move. "She's mine." Emily let out an inhuman scream as her body arched, writhing against an unseen force. The priest's chanting grew louder, his voice cutting through the suffocating darkness. The bear shook violently, its fur beginning to smolder. And then silence. Emily collapsed. The bear lay lifeless beside her, its fur burnt to blackened ashes. The house was still, the heavy presence gone. It was over. Or so they thought. 3 years later, on the morning of Emily's 18th birthday, she awoke to find a package sitting at the foot of her bed. Old. Yellowed. With a single word scrawled across the top. Emily. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, the bear stared up at her. And from deep within its hollow stuffing came a whisper. Did you miss me?